Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to our webinar. My name is Isabel Hilton. I'm the CEO of China Dialogue, which of course is the best source of information on everything to do with climate change and China. And we're delighted to be part of London Climate Action Week 2020. And I hope you've been taking part and enjoying the discussions about how the world can get back to the urgent business of climate change as we emerge, we hope, from the pandemic. Will China, the world's biggest emitter, build back green? Or will it reach for the old high carbon formula to restore growth and reduce unemployment? Those of you who follow China Dialogue will know that China is both the biggest climate problem and potentially the most important solution. It's fully signed up to the Paris Agreement, but its national ambition is still low. It is, at the same time, a renewable superpower and the biggest user of coal. It embraces ecological civilization at the highest level, but doesn't always practice it. So the potential for taking world-changing decisions is there, but will China take them? Well, to discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined by a really great panel today. First up will be from Beijing, Shuo, who's the Senior Global Policy Advisor for Greenpeace and a very well-known and respected analyst of all things climate and China. Also from Beijing, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Chen, who's the principal at the Rocky Mountain Institute and one of the authors of the recent report Achieving Green Recovery for China, putting zero carbon electrification at the core, jointly released by the Energy Transition Commission and Rocky Mountain Institute. And normally based in London, both Yunnan Chen, Senior Research Officer at the Overseas Development Institute, and Sam Geall, my colleague here at China Dialogue, our Executive Editor. Now, the format will be that we'll hear from each of them, then we'll have some discussion, and then we'll open up to your questions. So please put your questions into the Q&A that you will see at the bottom of your screen. Now, to get a sense of where we are now, I want to hear from each of our speakers, and I'd like to begin with you, Shuo. Do you think China's going to build back green?
Thanks very much, Isabel, and I just want to thank you and colleagues at China Dialogue for inviting me to this very timely discussion. I'll just try to say a few words with regard to China's economic recovery policy so far. And also some of the key items to watch, for the remaining of this year. I think everybody knows that China has been in the recovery phase for the past 2-3 months. Since late March, China has brought the number of new COVID cases to a fairly small and manageable scale. So starting from then, the policy priority has been to restore and recover the economy. A major milestone for the economic recovery is, of course, the National People's Congress, which happened in the last week of May. It's really the major tone-setting event. I think there are 5 things that the listeners should be aware of with regard to what happened at the NPC. The first thing is the most headline grabbing, which is China did not set an annual GDP growth target this year. This is quite significant, given that China has always, done so over the past decade. I think on one hand, this highlights the significant uncertainty in China's economy as a result of COVID-19, but also on the other hand, it is fair to say that no GDP target alleviated some of the immediate concerns that many in the environmental community had, on the possibility that China may embrace a significant round of infrastructure build-up. The second thing for the NPC is both at the meeting, but also in the run-up to it, the concept of new infrastructure has got a lot of attention and discussion. And what new infrastructure means is primarily the digital infrastructure that China wants to embrace for a higher quality growth. And this includes 5G, artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, and so on. And the political intention here, of course, is try to mark a difference between the old and traditional way of growing our economy, primarily by relying on concrete and steel. The third thing is a set of fiscal and monetary policies, policy measures were also introduced at MPC. These include various government bonds, but also fiscal deficit. Taken all together, these fiscal and monetary measures amount to about 6.4% of China's GDP in 2019. So it is quite a considerable package, but fairly modest compared to what happened in 2008 and 9 when China was encountered with the global financial crisis. And the fourth thing is the omission of a number of numerical environmental targets, in the government report that was issued by the MPC. I think that's a sign, to suggest that there is indeed a downplay of, the environmental aspect in the recovery, given the tremendous economic challenges. And then the last thing that I would say with regard to MPC is that the COVID crisis is quite different from any of the crises that we've seen in history. It is still, an ongoing crisis. It is still unfolding, both in China, but also in the rest of the world. And I think that means, as I said, the MPC set the initial tone for China's recovery, but it didn't really set it in stone. I think a lot of the policy measures will still need to be adjusted based on the situation of the pandemic. And as a result of that, we also can anticipate some ongoing horse trading between various interest groups in China, in terms of, for example, where the money will go. And indeed, we have registered, since the MPC, a few early signals that would suggest a departure between the rhetoric, which is relatively environmentally friendly, and the practice on the ground. I'll just give everybody two examples before I conclude. One is in the first 5 months of this year, we have seen in total 48 gigawatt of coal-fired power plants being added into the pipeline. Just to give everybody a sense, 48 gigawatt is more than the total coal fleet of Germany, hard coal and lignite combined in Germany. The UK, if my number is correct, has less than 5 gigawatt of coal-fired power plant. So China is adding, just in the first 5 months of this year, 48 gigawatt. The second data point, in May, single month of May this year, compared to the same month of last year, we have actually registered an increase of GHG emissions. So that suggests, to some extent, the recovery is already happening, and the emissions is actually growing back and further than year on year last year. Let me just conclude by saying that there are three factors that will determine the future environmental and climate trajectory in China. Of course, the economic situation, as I mentioned. Second thing is the coal fever. How will that unfold? Can we stop that from happening further? And of course, the third thing is the overall geopolitical situation, which I understand some of the subsequent panelists will touch upon. So I'll just leave it here and very much look forward to the Q&A and the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shuo. That was a very gripping, if not entirely encouraging scenario. Dr. Chen, your report urges a low carbon pathway on China. Do you think that China, when it's building back after COVID, is really going to embrace that?
We definitely hope so. So thank you very much, Isabel, to mention our report. Actually, in our report, we try to focus on how to design for China the short-term economic policies, which not only support a strong recovery from the COVID-19 crisis, but also do not delay and ideally accelerate the required energy transition towards a zero carbon future. So after the global finance crisis of 2008, China faced a very similar challenges and used a huge credit finance boom in infrastructure and real estate investment to keep the economy going, but at expenses, including the rapid rising of carbon emissions. So in our report, our conclusion include China's post-COVID-19 economic recovery needs to be largely stimulated by investment, similar to its response to the global finance crisis in 2009. But investment stimulus must be different to avoid the adverse side effects that are observed for the global finance crisis stimulus and meet the evolving needs that China is having. So everyone in China now, including Mr. Li Shuo just now, are talking about the new infrastructure investment. This is largely about the new ICT-based infrastructure, such as 5G, AI, and IoT. But an investment on these areas will still be a lot smaller compared with the traditional infrastructure, like roads, water, sewage system, industrial park, convention center, things like that. It's therefore almost inevitable to that any of this investment to stimulate the economy, right, will involve a significant focus on urban infrastructure and the transport system. So the optimal policy should seek both to reduce systematic bias, which overly favor investment on traditional infrastructure, and to ensure that new infrastructure investment is made as energy efficient, green, and sustainable as possible. So we conclude that the 4 pillars of a green recovery package should be considered in China's economic recovery plan. We are very pleased, as Mr. Li Shuo just mentioned, that in the NPC, Premier Li Keqiang's annual work plan setting out for the administration, including 3 of them. That include, for example, strengthen investment in new technology-based forms of infrastructure, ensuring the investment in traditional infrastructure supports green and energy efficient urbanization, and promote green consumption with a strong focus on electrification. So all these 3 pillars that we try to suggest to the Chinese government, they have already mentioned in their NPC report as a work plan for this year. However, we think the core of all this, if we want to achieve a green recovery, is to accelerate the investment in zero carbon electrification. So with that, I'm going to stop here, but I think I can share more of our findings in our report later, perhaps in the Q&A session. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chen. We look forward to hearing more. There is still some, I think, uncertainty over precisely what China plans or what the next and critical 5-year plan will contain. But of course, China's climate influence is no longer confined to China itself, but is enacted across the world through the Belt and Road. Yunnan, this question of China's post-COVID recovery also impacts on China's global footprint. How do you see it at present? How do you see this recovery in climate terms in the global strategy?
Right. Thank you, Isabel, and really happy to be here. Firstly, with these other distinguished speakers. Regarding China's global footprint, my focus in my remarks is going to be largely on development finance and in energy finance. COVID-19 is going to become a critical juncture for this trend of overseas lending and the global impact, particularly in energy and in clean energy finance. There's a question mark still over the sustainability of the Belt and Road Initiative and how this trend in global energy finance is going to shift in the future. In the 2010s, there was this crescendo in Chinese development finance overseas, and a large part of that was driven by domestic trends and overcapacity at home. In the Belt and Road Initiative in particular, we've seen a huge component of that has been in energy. But there's a very mixed bag in these trends. So globally, according to the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University, China's official policy banks, the China Exim Bank and China Development Bank, has funded around $251.3 billion US in energy finance globally over the last 2 decades. But this trend has been very disproportionately towards fossil fuels. So when we take away hydropower and focus only on renewable energy, solar, wind, geothermal, this is only about 5% of total spending. About 3/4 of this finance in the Belt and Road Initiative in particular has gone towards fossil fuel sectors. Of new power plants that have been built overseas, over half are still coal-fired power plants. So there's been this sort of paradox where domestically China has been, there's been this growing rhetoric and turn towards a cleaner energy pathway, towards greater investment in renewables, and yet overseas, this energy finance and impact overseas is still very much dominated by fossil fuels and particularly coal. I think one silver lining to this is that some researchers at Harvard had shown that when you compare Chinese parent company owned power plants, or Chinese parent company built power plants overseas, they do have better environmental performance. So they have lower emissions intensity and higher energy efficiency standards than non-Chinese built power plants. But still, this is not a fundamentally sustainable trend, even if the environmental performance is better. It's not going to be compatible with the Paris climate goals going forward. There's another problem now with the impacts of COVID-19, where there's going to be a crunch point for this flow of development finance, a significant part of which has also gone towards renewables. In the last 5 years or so, we have also seen a plateau and a steady decrease in the amount of development finance coming from Chinese sources from the official policy banks, Exim Bank and China Development Bank. And the immediate impacts of COVID-19 have been quite dramatic and extremely severe for developing countries in particular. There's going to be a huge credit crunch, both on the supply and demand side, where the ability of developing countries now to borrow externally and to invest in clean energy is also going to be increasingly constrained. So in the case of Africa, for example, the impacts of COVID have been primarily economic and then subsequently in the health sector, where in the immediate wake of global lockdowns, we saw a drying up of trade, investment, growing constraints in supply chain linkages, capital flight from the continent, and now an increasing risk of debt distress. And China has been a responsible and I should say responsive development partner in trying to work and cooperate with developing countries on these financial issues. So China has taken part in the G20 debt suspension initiative for 77 developing countries, and has also shown signals that it's willing to work with developing countries on managing their debt issues. But I think the immediate economic impact from COVID is going to have quite negative demands for the future demand of these developing countries for clean energy technology. It's already treated with some suspicion, some skepticism in many developing countries. It's seen as a greater risk. It's seen as higher cost. And on the supply side, it's, I think, unlikely that China will be anywhere as active as a financier as it was in the 2010s. So this financial war chest that was channeled into the Belt and Road Initiative is also going to be refunneled and have to reprioritize the domestic economy in the coming years. So in terms of a future trends and shift, I think there has to be two main shifts. Firstly, for developing countries, there has to be a move away from this debt finance that's characterized energy and infrastructure investments in the last 20 years. We have to move towards a more sustainable model, perhaps with more private sector participation that doesn't put disproportionate financial risks on developing countries. And secondly, I think there has to be a policy and a cultural commitment away from coal and fossil fuels. So developing countries also need to build the regulatory and investment environment that would be more conducive to renewable energy investments. On the part of Chinese official finance, it's still yet to follow in the footsteps of other development finance institutions. So, for example, like the European Investment Bank and many other Western DFIs have now put in pledges to shift away from coal energy finance. And we've yet to see that from Chinese development finance institutions. But also in developing countries, there has to be some cultural shift there. Right. What we see from Chinese official finance is that it's still very demand-led. It's responsive to what developing countries want. And right now, there's an opportunity for developing countries to restate their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, and to signal to these international investors a new cleaner energy pathway in the post-COVID recovery.
Thank you so much, Yunnan. So big impacts, but not yet a change in direction. I think if I understand you rightly, Sam Geall, Yunnan mentioned nationally determined contributions, and of course for London, for Britain, the question of COP26 looms, the postponed climate conference, which was meant to take place in Glasgow at the end of the year, now put off a year. And China's climate policy obviously takes place within a framework of a wider global context. So as you look at China's recovery from the pandemic, tell us what you see in terms of its climate commitments.
Thanks, Isabel, and thanks to all the other speakers for such an interesting introduction, both on the sort of domestic energy and climate pathways and the overseas finance element. Yeah, to link it up, I guess we need to look at why this is a critical year, and that requires really thinking about where we are in terms of the UNFCCC, the UN Climate Framework Convention, in a very critical moment, and in a critical moment for policymaking in China as we go into the 14th five-year plan, the details of which will be announced in March next year. So this is a really critical moment for the UN climate talks. We're 5 years on from Paris. For those of you who aren't specifically climate watchers, the significance of this 5-year mark is that Paris is a kind of bottom-up, well, it's a kind of hybrid convention that has both a bottom-up aspect, which are the nationally determined contributions, these pledges that countries put into the treaty, but it's also got this top-down overarching mechanism, which is about trying to raise ambition so that we can get to the 1.5 degree goal. Currently, we're on track for about 3.2 degrees. If we're to get to 1.5 degrees, we need a significant increase in ambition over the next 10 years. And that means at this next COP, which of course was supposed to happen at the end of this year, now it's happening at the end of 2021 in Glasgow, first time the UK has hosted the talks, there's going to need to be a significant increase in ambition from parties. And of course, that includes China. There's no, there's no way, given the sheer size of China's economy, that there can be any kind of ambition in the UN climate talks without ambition from China, and doubly so with the regretful withdrawal or planned withdrawal of the United States. China, to its credit, of course, has stayed the course since Trump's withdrawal, but that kind of puts the pressure even more on China to actually walk the talk. And so we need to sort of think about what that means in terms of the global outlook for environmental negotiations. 2020 was planned to be something that was called the super year for the environment. The idea was not only was there going to be the COP26 talks at the end of the year, but also the Convention on Biological Diversity talks hosted in Kunming, which was supposed to take place in the autumn, and a range of other negotiations and processes broadly around nature, climate, and health. And the idea was essentially that you'd create a kind of what people have called an arc of engagement, or a golden thread between all these different processes, in order to kind of create synergies across and between all these negotiations, and renew international cooperation and unlock greater global ambition towards the Sustainable Development Goals around themes, for example, like nature-based solutions. Of course, this has been, deeply impacted by COVID-19 for a range of reasons, not only because there's been inevitable delays to the talks themselves, and that they've had to be sort of pushed into next year in the case of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the climate talks, but also because of rising international tensions, not least between US and China, which of course used to be a linchpin of the climate convention, and the extent to which the fears of an economic recession can lead to a backburnering of environmental concerns. And much of the sort of tension around the narratives for the recovery, I think, will come in, whether indeed that's what happens. I mean, certainly in the United States, we've seen that the economic concerns around COVID-19 have led to bailouts for fossil fuel and for other carbon-intensive industries. In Europe, by contrast, we have the European Green Deal looking to kind of harness some of those synergies around a greener recovery. The question for China is, in this critical moment, whether it can, which way it can swing. Now, when it comes to walking the talk, as we've heard, there's significant concerns. And I think these are concerns that are shared by China's potential partners in recreating this kind of cooperation in the next couple of years as we try to get things back on track. China needs to find partnerships in order to sort of create this recovery. I do think that China more than ever has an opportunity to burnish its environmental credentials, to benefit its most innovative industries, its leading low carbon sectors, and to become a leading supplier of the technologies of the future, and to help spur a greener recovery. And it's a very appealing message for China to advance on the world stage at a moment when its reputation is being, compromised on a lot of other fronts, not only by the pandemic, but all kinds of other concerns. And in order to find partnerships that can really work, China can actually sort of capitalize on its progress here. But to do that, it will have to face the fact that it's being deeply undermined by its own domestic buildup of coal in particular. And Li Shuo mentioned that 40 plus gigawatts of coal that's been installed in the first, or at least planned and under construction in the first 6 months of this year. And it also needs to grapple with the fact that it's become known as the biggest financier of coal overseas, which again, enormously undermines that effort to burnish its reputation internationally. A key partnership could be and should be with the European Union. One of the major plans for the Super Year of the Environment was to build ambition at the planned Leipzig summit under the German presidency of the EU in the second half of this year, in order to create a kind of new diplomatic engine for ambition under the UN climate talks. That again has been delayed. Partly it's about COVID, partly it's about the lack of real progress around any kinds of effective mechanism between Europe and China. And again, a way that China could build its bona fides is by really taking seriously its reputation around the build out of coal. And if you look at Ursula von der Leyen's remarks from the latest EU-China call, you can see there is there's an obvious concern around China's reputation internationally. Von der Leyen says, China has repeatedly projected itself as a leader on global climate issues, and China is indeed on our side on this. However, being a leader brings responsibility to follow up with actions. We count on China to live up to its commitments under the Paris Agreement and step them up and lead by example. We look forward to seeing decarbonisation play a big role in China's next 5-year plan, as the European Green Deal plays a big role in our strategic agenda as well. So this really underlines that China's at a dangerous moment, with people looking at the new data coming out and realizing that this year is absolutely critical, not only for the potential carbon bubble that's sort of being built with new coal on the ground, but particularly with decisions that are being made around the 14th five-year plan. And this is really at the forefront of policymakers' minds in Europe. They are looking at what kinds of indications there'll be for not only a potential carbon emissions cap, which of course is a very progressive proposal, which I would hope China would build into a 14th five-year plan, but specifically caps on coal-fired capacity. Will China raise its cap on coal-fired capacity in the 14th five-year plan? The world really will be watching to see that, because there are potential proposals that it will be raised to 1,300 gigawatts, which would mean a huge expansion in China's coal-fired capacity. So these are really critical questions at this moment. And if China wants to rebuild trust and cooperation around the Convention on Biological Diversity and the UN climate talks, it does need to kind of walk the talk, and that will really help to rebuild the kind of space for cooperation internationally around a potential year of international cooperation going into 2021, where of course Italy will be hosting the G20, one of the co-hosts of the UN climate talks. The UK will be hosting the G7. China will be hosting the CBD. UK will be hosting the UN climate talks in Glasgow. There is a potential kind of sequencing that one could find with increased national ambition, increased international talks, and a kind of some really progressive and holistic kind of synergies that could be created across environmental negotiations to recreate a year of ambition around nature, climate, and health. But that does require China really making clear some increased ambition, particularly in the 14th five-year plan. So I'll leave it there.
Sam, thank you very much. Lots to pick out there, and as you said, very critical moment in China's policy. I'm very struck that all four of you are not surprised, actually, but still very struck by the fact that coal figured so large in all of your opening remarks. And in order to kind of understand this, what has always seemed to me a kind of policy paradox, I'd really like you to help me out here. We've had report after report that says that building new coal at this point is essentially building stranded assets. We know that coal-fired power plants are operating below their capacity in China. Most of them are loss-making. Why then build more coal? It doesn't really seem to me to make sense. It's not cheap. It's not sustainable. It's damaging to China's reputation, and it's very, very damaging to China's climate prospects. And China, we shouldn't forget, is highly vulnerable. Li Shuo, I know you think about this. I'd like to ask all of you, but perhaps we could begin with Li Shuo. Help me understand what the drivers are here.
Yeah, thanks, Isabel. So at Greenpeace, we do spend a lot of time digging coal data. I guess several things to say here. One is I mentioned there are 48 gigawatt of new projects that are brought online this year. I just want to kind of zoom out a bit by saying that this represents a larger, longer term trend, which started in 2018 when the authority of approving coal-fired power plants were, given from the central government to the provinces. So that's a major reason why, starting from 2-3 years ago, we are observing more and more coal-fired power plants being approved. The incentives to the local players are actually quite clear. Coal-fired power plants could generate GDP, at least on the account book, right, in the short term. Can generate construction jobs, can generate tax revenue. And all of these are quite appealing.
Stimulus idea. Yeah.
Exactly. These are all very appealing in the context of the COVID crisis. And I would say, even though annual GDP target is not emphasized this year by the central level leadership, there's still very strong inertia in the Chinese bureaucracy to prioritize economic growth to maintain that there are jobs there for Chinese people. You mentioned, Isabel, the very ironic fact that although installation capacity is going up, China's actual coal consumption is stabilizing. So indeed, the result of adding in more coal capacity is that they will actually not burn coal, but money. So they will become stranded assets. In fact, currently, the load factor of China's coal-fired power plants is about 50%, meaning they are only used for about half of the time. And the international standard is normally more than 85%. I think that still means that avoiding coal-fired power plant construction is still quite important, from a climate angle. Even though the overall coal consumption is not going up, because of course this large-scale infrastructure will definitely risk China locking in to a medium to long-term high carbon trajectory.
Sure. Well, I'm not sure if burning money, not coal is a viable slogan, but we could work on it. Dr. Chen, given that you're urging China to a path of climate virtue and in zero emissions electricity, how much does the investment in coal figure as an inhibitor? Because what money going into coal isn't going into the things that you'd like to see.
Yeah, actually, this is the question that we are trying to digging out in the past few weeks. What we found, and we took a number rounds of interviews, particularly with the grid operators, and what we found, there were, apart from what Mr. Li Shuo mentioned, mostly about kind of like a political factors, political considerations behind the idea of supporting new coal. What we found out, there were at least another 2 layers of reasons behind that. It's technical and also economic. For the technical, we feel like there's at least 2 misguided assertions. One is that the additional coal capacity is necessary for grid reliability and flexibility, for meeting more demand, electricity demand, and adopting more renewable energy. Right. The second technical bias assumption is that new coal remains more economic in terms of LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity, and also in terms of the incremental system cost. So if people argue that if you add all this cost on, it doesn't make sense to put more renewable rather than the new coal. So those are kind of like a misguided belief, apart from the political vested interest behind that.
Okay. And Yunnan, you also talked of coal, but you mentioned the question of expertise in host countries in managing or in seeking energy systems that were not traditional. I just wonder, in looking at China's reputation as a development actor, as a country that is committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, would it not make sense for China as a development actor to support countries to make this transition, rather than to reinforce, if you like, the position that they have, which maybe rests on a lack of expertise or understanding?
Yeah, there's a sort of, as you point out, there's a bit of a paradox, but there is a trend of growing renewable energy finance from Chinese sources. What's interesting about that is when you look overseas at this growth in renewable energy or non-fossil fuel based energy, a lot of that actually comes from Chinese private sector sources. So there is the expertise and there is the capacity there. And I think, similar to what the other speakers have mentioned about the sort of domestic political economy issues, we also see similar political economy factors at work in this demand for coal in developing countries. There's still in many countries, an entrenched interest around coal. If you have an abundance of coal resources and you want to develop your economy, it's still seen as a perceived, whether accurately or not, as a more reliable energy source than renewables, which are perceived as less consistent and more volatile. Especially in certain countries such as South Africa, for one example, as well, you have quite strong labor interests within the coal mining sector that also make it very politically difficult to shift away from these traditional fossil fuel sectors towards renewable energy, even when it would make technological sense and definitely environmentally and in terms of achieving climate goals.
Okay, so just going back to the broader context, the broader international context, one of our viewers is asking how we see the EU's call for China to commit to a 2050 net zero target during that EU-China call 2 weeks ago, which I think it would be fair to say was full of tensions and didn't end entirely positively. But Dr. Chen, do you think that's a realistic ask politically and practically, a net zero target by 2050?
I think that's definitely a reasonable ask, but whether or not we should make it a political, that's the issue that I want to highlight here. Because let me give you my own experience. Last year, we launched a report called China 2050, a fully developed rich economy, zero carbon economy. And we've got a very positive response or feedbacks from industry people, from industry association, financial institute. And this January, we already seen some organizations have already launched a zero carbon China initiative, right? And when we talked to them, they told us that the market, the investors, and the industry business people, they are quite interested in this idea because it opened another, a very broad business opportunity for their business growth. People, investors and the business people are always following the growth. And when they see there's an opportunity for growth, they will, bet their money on. So I'm not sure if this is a wise kind of move to ask this question politically, in a very political way, from the top down. But I did see, there's a huge interest from the market, from the bottom up kind of a broad approach.
Right. Talking of bottom-up approach, and another viewer is asking about the role of public opinion, whether people in China are concerned about this. I think we know that people in China are concerned about environmental issues such as air pollution and things which affect daily life. But Li Shuo, is there any sign that there is concern about climate change, and that there is public pressure in any way on the government?
Yeah, well, I think there are probably concerns on environmental degradation in China overall, and over the past few years, we've definitely observed increase in environmental awareness, and that in fact has been registered in various polls. The Pew Research Center, they've been doing this annual poll to ask the general public from around the world in terms of their level of concern on various issues, and China's public has always put environmental issues quite high. Given that said, I think the COVID situation is indeed quite an overwhelming one. So I think it will be a stretch to say that the general public would still perceive environmental concern ahead of some of the other more tangible and practical ones, such as, their job security or level of income. So I think, this will indeed present as a challenge in terms of moving the conversations, for example, on air pollution forward in the next few years, and also bear in mind the quality of the air, but also water, soil are also improving over the past few years. So ironically, the improvement may actually present a challenge for more public engagement. If I may, Isabel, just very quickly, just to add on the 2050 net zero question, I thought what Dr. Chen said was really interesting. The point that to push the 2050 net zero at the political level might be quite challenging at this stage. And on that, I completely agree with him. And also the importance of having the tactical level discussions on this particular matter first. I thought that's quite pragmatic. And the reason that I'm saying this is if you look at the domestic conditions in China, to go completely zero in 30 years' time, I think the conditions are still not there. So there is a need for you to have the initial technical discussions and to gradually facilitate that political appetite. And let me also say another thing, which is we also need to focus on the short term, because that's the early actions, the short-term actions matters more to the quality of our environment. So in this regard, I would slightly prioritize the NDC discussion ahead of the long-term strategy, the 2050 net zero.
Right. So I mean, I think we are in a rather complicated global situation, as we all know, and the discussion on climate is affected by rather the negative energy that's zipping around the diplomatic relations. So it's interesting that you can still perceive a way of, if you like, influencing China from the outside, as long as it's not a high-level political challenge. So perhaps that was, in your view, a mistake. Sam, talking of positive narratives, another question that's come in is how can China link up the various strands that you laid out in your presentation of nature and climate and biodiversity and the many issues that are on the table, which are not separate issues at all. But is there any sign that China is managing to weave these into a more positive, linked up narrative, the synergies between health, climate and nature, which is essentially what we need as a kind of vision?
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's certainly a potential for it. And there were some positive signs, or there are some positive signs, sort of certainly rhetorically, particularly in the pre-COVID era from China. I mean, there's no question that China has made environmental rhetoric a really, has made a very strong play of it in government propaganda over the last 5 years. Xi Jinping has made ecological civilization a kind of a signature leadership slogan. It's a slogan that's been around for a while, but it's never been kind of more prominent in many ways. And it clearly links to big domestic top-down goals. It's not about responding to international pressure. It's very much a domestic narrative about national rejuvenation, and it's very linked to those goals around national rejuvenation. So clearly, particularly around this concept of ecological civilization, there are ways that you could see that those nature, climate, health, maybe even also sort of development and equity and these sort of positive social goals being interwoven. And things like the Convention on Biological Diversity talks are significant in that regard. The fact that China, wanted to host these UN talks for the first time and to put ecological civilization sort of at the center of that speaks to China's desire to be seen to be equal on the international stage with other nations and to get its ideas out there. And they are also the chair under the UNFCCC, under the UN climate talks, of the nature-based solutions track. And that's the track that specifically links together climate and biodiversity. Climate change is one of the major drivers of biodiversity loss. It's one of the big drivers that's acknowledged under the CBD, under the Convention on Biological Diversity. So there's an obvious kind of interlinkage there. China also wants to lead specifically on initiatives around things like afforestation and spatial planning, i.e. kind of nature reserves and so-called ecological red lines. So there's a number of ideas that I think China would like to lead on. And of course, they all link to the sorts of new frameworks that we need to deal with pandemic disease and preparedness in light of COVID-19 and indeed other threats of kind of emerging zoonotic diseases. We've seen this other recent case of a swine transmitted zoonotic disease outbreak. These all point to the ways in which we actually need to build more resilient systems that can look across these sorts of emerging threats, particularly emerging threats associated with essentially the kind of intensification of a globalized agricultural system around supply chains, around all of the kinds of interlinkages that we know we live in. You know, we live in an increasingly globalized, interlinked world, yet the systems that we need to deal with the risks associated with those seem to be only sort of getting weaker. And this is really a key moment to say, okay, let's actually think seriously about what kinds of systems for controlling emerging risks and dealing with the kinds of globally proliferating risks of an increasingly globalized system we need. And actually, you know, again, this is a moment where China can and should take some leadership, given that they are in a leadership position on the Convention on Biological Diversity. But they need to step up. CBD, particularly, just to say one last thing, on CBD, China needs to show more leadership because it is the host this year or next year, yet there's very little sign that it has, for example, appointed a chair, that is made clear what the agenda is going to look like. Right. The world is waiting for this. China has an open door to really lead on these kinds of agendas.
So a big responsibility there. On this question of linkages, I have two questions which kind of derive from what's coming in from our viewers. One, Yunnan, I'd like to ask you about, which is this relationship, across issues between China's domestic and international policy, because it isn't just on coal. You did talk earlier about the Belt and Road in the beginning as certainly fulfilling the function of absorbing excess capacity that China perhaps should have closed down, high carbon excess capacity, which was deployed on the Belt and Road. But China's also, if you look at it across the piece, a driver of all sorts of other things, land use changes, deforestation, wildlife crime, overfishing. I mean, there's quite a lot going on here. And I sometimes have the impression that, there is a domestic political sphere, and then kind of what happens abroad, as long as, it's not brought to China's attention, can be used as a bit of a safety valve. Is that unfair? Or do you see signs that China is beginning to look at what is, after all, a global set of problems with a global sense of responsibility?
Yes, thank you for that. I think kind of referring back to what other presenters have already mentioned, China has much greater reputational risks in its overseas activities. And in recent years, there's this growing trend that it is trying to be responsive to the optics of what its projects generate and impact overseas. In many cases, such as the coal power plants that I mentioned, we do actually see quite high performing projects that are financed by Chinese sources overseas. And perhaps because these attract greater scrutiny than what happens domestically, there is a greater potential for international pressure to force China to do better in the kind of infrastructure that it finances, in the social and environmental standards that it enforces. To date, the record around the sort of social and environmental impacts of Chinese projects, it hasn't, there's been a very kind of mixed record for this. So, in a lot of the renewable energy that China does finance, the biggest part of that is hydropower, which is, of course, a hugely
controversial,
significant project for ecological impacts, for societies, for displacement. And China's official financial institutions don't yet have a very strong social and environmental framework to deal with these kind of impacts to the extent that the World Bank or other Western DFIs would. And that, I think, needs to change.
Thank you. I'm sorry to push you. I'm very conscious of our shrinking time window here, and there are so many questions now coming in that we would love to address. But the second linkages point, which has also come up in the feedback, is for Li Shuo and Chen Ji. China, it is often said that China thinks long-term, unlike short-term Western democracies. I have some issues with that, but nevertheless, plans are made. China has a top-level slogan of eco-civilization. China's leaders are not climate deniers. There's no problem there. But at the same time, we know that climate change is slipping down the agenda. And we also know that China is highly, highly vulnerable to climate impacts, what with coastal cities, what with water issues. And that, for example, Xi Jinping's target to eliminate poverty by the end of the year could equally well be reversed by climate change. So why is climate change, or how can climate change become, the top line issue from which other policies derive, rather than at the moment it seems to be a bit of an afterthought, or something that will be accommodated if it can be. So briefly, if you can, I know I'm asking a big question, but if you could keep it brief, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Li Shuo.
I can take the first step. I'd be interested to hear what Chen Ji will say. I think there's an intrinsic challenge that everybody recognizes with regard to climate action. Climate impact tends to be slow onset event. It's not as immediate as air pollution or the loss of job. So I think that challenge presents itself very much in the Chinese context. But I mean, you were asking for solutions, Isabel. I think one way forward, and this has already been tested and proven, is to frame the climate agenda and to connect it with other social and political priorities. We've seen how the global community has managed to connect the need to work on climate change and sustainable development. Develop your economy, sustainably. These are, two things that are very much in line with each other. I think, given the geopolitical challenges that Sam mentioned, one promising area that I can see in the next few years is to, bring together the geopolitical angle of climate action and the need to take environmental action itself. If you look at how China has approached the climate agenda, to a large extent, it is a diplomatic effort, right? And China is not in a very favorable place these days at the global stage. And I think there is a need, again, to think about how climate action can help change that situation.
Chen Ji, you mentioned appealing to the business side of things rather than the political side. Is that the solution? How do we keep climate right up at the top of the agenda?
Just want to give you a very short observation. If you look back in the history, particularly in terms of how China participated in the UNFCCC, you will have this observation, like I have, is that at the very beginning, Chinese government think this is a kind of international relationship issue, right? When there's a certain time, a certain period, I feel Chinese government see it as a development issue. Now, the responsibility of addressing climate change in terms of government agencies shifted to the Ministry of Ecology and Environment. I feel maybe the government see it more as an environment issue. But to address your question, Isabel, I think it will be better if we have, if the Chinese government still see it as a development problem. In that way, it will give a much more, priority and address all these multilateral challenges that you just mentioned.
Very good advice. Sadly, I hear my clock striking downstairs, and we have so many questions we would love to address. But on China Dialogue, we address these questions every day. So if you want to follow these issues, please follow ChinaDialogue.net. Thank you for being with us. It's a critical part of our climate future, what China does. And a huge thank you to our wonderful panelists, Dr. Chen, Shuo, Yunnan, Chen, and Sam Geall. A recording of this discussion will be available, and of course, China Dialogue publishes every day. Please check out the remaining events on the astonishing London Climate Action Week 2020, and we look forward to connecting with you again soon. But for now, from all of us here, goodbye.